So I was like going through and pulling the ones that were the most important because some of them like weren't, you know.
That's my experience with a lot of reader apps.
I was so
Kindle
pissed, dude.
Kindle works pretty well. That's probably the best one, but like all the other reader apps are
I mean, honestly, like iBooks is fine. It's like smooth sailing for the most part. I like that it has the function where you can see your notes in the margin if you do it on the desktop. Like honestly, a lot of ways in which it's great. I don't know if it's just like my software that didn't like isn't updated. I had to like sign into it's just a bunch of bullshit. Like it's probably just some stupid.
it's more like the software, like that's the thing is that it's the software works fine for its main function, which is to read PDFs or whatever, you know? But then when like these little functions that just don't work,
Dude,
like oh,
yeah.
you can export your notes, but like you can't really because it doesn't work.
Or
And then
like you
like
can't in the mobile app, but you can on the desktop. And for
right.
whatever reason, even if I checked the box that was like, share notes across devices, share highlights and notes across devices, it didn't import that way.
Yeah, Apple
And I was
does
like,
that.
oh, this
Yeah.
will be easy. And it just didn't import. And I was like, I could delete it from my library, but I was like, no, I'm gonna like, I don't want to risk losing all my shit. Like, not right now. This is not the day. I set myself to inactive on Slack. Oof, man, yeah, that's a hell of a copy. I would say that we just plug like, I'm sure that's a nice copy to have if you're like interested in reading all of Fitzgerald. I honestly don't know that I am.
I have two. I read
I would
two of the
also
novels
plug
in it.
what is it? Mass market because it's like $5 or some shit.
Yeah,
I almost bought it. But I was
I
like, no, there's got to be two copies of this at my house. There weren't.
I only bought this crappy kind of print on demand one because yeah, it had all four of his novels in it,
Yeah.
and I'm a sucker for that. So I'm just like, all right, if it was like 20 bucks,
I'm a
like for
sucker
twenty
for like a
bucks,
flimsy copy I can carry
and
around.
if I
But
bought,
that's
I could buy the four, $5 copies. It would be the same price. So I just like did it all in one book, and I was just like, yeah, fuck it. He's old enough that this stuff is in the public domain and stuff, so that people are just doing like print on demand versions, whatever.
yeah, I mean like you can also just get it for free on Apple Books
Yeah, also like it's so
or
popular. I'm
wherever.
sure
Yeah.
I'm sure it's free online everywhere.
Yeah, there are a bunch of audiobooks that are free. There are multiple versions that are free. And then like if you're a sucker, you can pay for the Jake Gyllenhaal version, which I don't know why you would. Like,
Jake Gyllenhaal version.
yeah, there's a Jake Gyllenhaal version that he narrated. There's a lot of that.
Oh, an audiobook?
Yeah, there are a
Okay.
lot of
Yeah.
those. And I'm like, they're almost never, with the exception of a few like maybe if like Tim Curry is reading one, like he'll be good because
What's
he like
normal?
does that.
Yeah. It's
But
normal to
like
have like
then sometimes you get
actors.
like Gyllenhaal, and I'm just
Yeah.
like, yeah, I don't like you're reading like slowly, like you're trying to act it, but like it's not. That's not what we're doing. Like, don't do that. But I don't know what it is, man. Sometimes it just pisses me off.
Yeah, I don't have much experience. I mean, I've listened to audiobooks, but I find that I prefer to not listen to them.
I
But it's like yeah, I mean they've always done actors. Like
yeah,
hired if it's a big enough book, they'll hire an actor
it
to do the
depends.
audio reading. And sometimes it works out, like you said. Sometimes they get an actor in there that can really like bring something out of it, like really
All you
bring
need is a
stuff
decent
to it.
voice actor or like someone
Yeah,
who's a good reader.
somebody
Like,
do cartoon voices, but Gyllenhaal is somebody like they're just doing that. I remember Matt Damon did like an audio narration of the people's
yeah,
history after the Goodwill Hunting thing.
it's a shame.
You know why they hired Matt Damon? I mean, not just because he's a famous actor, because of that fucking line in Goodwill Hunting
Yeah.
when he's talking to him. He's like, you fucking people baffle me. He's like, you spend all these money on books and they're the wrong damn books. He's like, what are the right books, Will? He's like, hey, whatever blows your hair back. And he's like, you read The Complete History of the United States, Volume 1. He's like, what you should really read is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass. That's the exact line. And then they had Matt Damon start narrating the audiobook for People's History of the United States.
Sounds like a terrible idea.
Have you read that?
As a listener, I
Yeah.
mean, like for me as a listener, I would hate that.
I,
No, I
I
haven't. We have a copy.
Yeah, everybody bought a copy when it came out because Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States was like
Yeah, it's Bill's
huge.
book.
Yeah. I bought it and read it, and it was, I was too young when I read it, but at the time I was like, yes, it's like a secret. He's revealing a secret. you know, it's like, yes,
Yeah.
it's secret history, secret. I believed it too. I was like 18 reading this book. Yeah. But it's written like a fucking textbook, dude. That's what bothered me about people. Because, I mean, he's a fucking history professor. So, like, it's written like a fucking history textbook, and it's fucking boring. Like, there's no, I don't really like nonfiction books either because of that. Unless you have a really good writer. Yeah, if it's a really good writer and it's nonfiction, then it's like very enjoyable. Well. Yeah, then it's enjoyable and like a pleasure to read. I was talking
some
to
of the Nazi ones are good.
The Nazi ones, yeah, dude.
Nazi ones are usually good.
I mean, every year there's like a new Nazi book, yeah.
Supposedly, this one reads like a novel almost, but I haven't read it yet.
Story of a Secret State.
Story of a Secret State by Jan Karski. He was like
What is that about, Hitler or the Nazis?
Yeah, well, it's a Holocaust memoir.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. He served as a liaison officer for the Polish underground during World War II and carried the first eyewitness report of the Holocaust to the mostly unbelieving West.
Right.
So, yeah.
Huh. Yeah. Sophie and I joke all the time. People know, like, the Hitler genre of book. There's like it's just like a genre of nonfiction book now, like the secret Hitler's secret Jews, right? Or like Hitler's secret army, or like
it was the one that I favor.
The one you'd recommend for
is Hitler's Jewish soldiers.
Yeah.
Fascinating. It's not one that you might not want to like sit down and read it, but it's certainly a good coffee table book.
Start a conversation in your house. People come into your house, they'd be like, "So, you a fascist?" Or
there are some fascinating portraits of like people throughout their experience of the war. Like there is this one guy where it was just like, here's an image of him before he was found out, and here's an image of him after he was found out, and the images are pretty different, like, but only because of what is happening on his face. And then there's this guy, this one guy, oh
pretty
my God,
horrific, you're saying?
Like, I mean, it just
like the,
like, it goes from like, I'm a young soldier and
healthy,
I'm just a strapping young man to like, oh shit,
to I was starved systemically for
not
years.
Even that, just like, I'm going to die in a minute because they just found out that I'm a quarter Jew.
Right, yeah.
So, well, because that's what it's really about, right? Because even if you were like, if you were Jewish and you could get away with, like,
survival mechanism,
that's what it was. It was like, so, as detestable as it might be, a lot of it was about just trying not to be found out. A lot of them were found out. There is this one guy, though, that my dad always points to, that we always open to, a man named Fritz Binder.
That is a Jewish name, yeah.
And there's this one black and white image of him as a strapping young, I guess, Nazi soldier carrying water buckets, like, on a pole, across his back. And and in the next photo is like the biggest, like, volcanic kind of fatty rolls of a man, who just, as my dad would say, looks like he takes the smelliest dumps in the world. Fritz Binder. It also sounds like it might be a kind of bowel movement you could have. Oh shit, I'm in a real Fritz Binder here.
Oh, this goddamn Fritz Binder.
Yeah, it sounds like constipation, really.
Yeah, some type of stopping up.
But yeah, it's wild. It's also, I mean, it's just interesting if you're like interested.
Well, I mean,
and that kind
everybody's
of thing.
fascinated. I mean, I think the reason that everybody's fascinated by the Third Reich is because it's like the most vivid kind of moment in the last, 100 years of history that everyone's just like, wow, that happened, like, so
Well, and a
everybody's kind of
fascination
like,
with like, oh, how do you become that? Like, how do
right.
you become someone who serves that cause?
Yeah.
Even as like a young Jewish person.
And it's even more disturbing when you actually read how one does that, where it's just like, it was just like, well, they were either, just trying to survive, or like you just believe it, or, just ordinary people that were just put into these positions. And like, if they weren't put into that position, maybe they wouldn't have gone into, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But like, since they were, just normal people start doing things that are hideous and ugly. And we're all like, oh my God, how does that happen?
I mean, yeah, it's
But
just...
that's that one book, Ordinary Men. I forget who writes it, but that...
Is that what it's called? I feel like...
Well, there's that... It's just one of many where
it
a
was like
sociologist
Ordinary People,
wrote this one about,
yeah.
just how, when they marched into Poland and then made the Polish be the guards at the camps kind of thing.
Yeah, you're right. Ordinary Men.
How did that happen? Like, these people...
Christopher Browning.
Yeah, okay. Interesting read if you're interested in that kind of stuff, but sometimes it can get pretty dark and like, yeah.
I mean, it's all really dark.
Yeah.
Another good one is The Light of Days. That's about the women's resistance in Poland.
Yeah, and I remember having to read like, Elie Wiesel and stuff. Like, I remember having to read that in school as a kid and really liking it. And then, I mean, a lot of these books they do give you in school if you're...
Yeah, this one's Judy Battalion, The Light of Days. It's pretty recent, I think, actually.
Oh, yeah, dude. Sure way to get a book deal. Write a book about the Third Reich, dude. And, like, the atrocities that happened in, like, the 20th century.
I imagine it's a pricier book. I got this copy used. I recommend getting it used. It's a good read. I say that I have yet to finish it.
I guess there was something online I kept seeing this week of people posting the statistics for book sales for last year.
Mm-hmm.
And it is pretty fucking dire, regardless of genre, regardless of popularity,
Yeah.
it's pretty, wow, it's sad. We're
Well,
literally
I mean,
overseeing the collapse of the industry. That's what finds this so crazy to me. All these people insisting they love books, insisting they love this stuff, and then they're just like presiding over the collapse of literacy and the actual publishing industry to irrelevancy. Nobody cares what the latest hot book is. Nobody gives a shit who the latest author is. Like, it's cultural irrelevancy. And then you see it just kind of compound. Like, nobody is...
That's
like,
the
even
thing,
the
though.
bestsellers...
There are still those that care. I have this friend that I was talking to her.
I just mean
and,
they
you know,
don't care
even,
enough
like,
to buy the books. It's just small niche community that
yeah,
does.
there are
So
these communities,
us,
but I
your
guess,
friend, yeah. Our listeners,
I mean,
maybe.
well, I even
like,
think like my sister, like, who, you know,
educated.
reads far more in a month than I probably do in 2. And she'll I mean,
Educated
she's read it
professional.
all.
Yeah, she's educated professional. Just
And she will still, like, you know, be like, all right, I'll read the Pulitzer, like,
right. Yeah.
you know, and she reads a lot. But, you know, I talk to people about it, and, you know, while they still, like, rely on these things, or they'll, like, hear someone talk about, like, a new author on a podcast or whatever it is, and, like, it was funny, I was talking to my one friend, and she was just like, man, I'm just so disappointed. Like, I had to, I don't know, I finished this book, and, like, and she's, like, been raving about it for, like, in a bad way,
Right.
like, for the last couple of weeks, that she's just so mad about this book. But
I guess we shouldn't say what the book is.
I mean, I don't even remember what it's
right.
called.
Yeah. We don't want to spread unnecessary.
No,
yeah.
I mean, it sounded like it was just a situation where there was a lot of telling and not showing, and it was very kind of, I don't know. But yeah, I don't know, I've talked to a couple people about that where they're just like, yeah, I just don't, it's the struggle to sift through everything, right? You're going to get 800 million recommendations of whatever hot new book someone is pushing somewhere, whether it's like because they had that connection and it was a friend, or it was, you know, just something that is closer to their personal interest, and that's fine. But it's really hard, I think,
Well,
for a lot of people to find.
There's there's more than ever, right? I saw it was a viral tweet a couple months ago, but I thought it captured something that was very accurate about almost every industry right now, where it just said everything is more popular and more niche than ever, like simultaneously. And it's a very weird dynamic that like we've managed to create for ourselves, that like things can be super popular while at the same time having like half the population have no idea what it is, you know, like type thing.
Yeah.
Books fall into that. They're kind of way down on
but
the
it's such,
list.
yeah, I mean, it's already such a small community, I think.
Well, and they keep narrowing it further.
I don't know.
Entire genres
like a lot
are
of
neglected.
fucking people read. Maybe it's just because, maybe I just feel that way because everyone in my immediate sphere reads.
Same, but I think that makes it so that we're not seeing the larger picture because we are so, you know, we're come out of a certain type of class or whatever. We're educated to a certain level. We actually have degrees in reading books. So, I mean, it's like we're a certain type of person.
But even people who don't, I think some people like grow into reading.
Sure. I think people
like
mature.
I think, and you know, it might not be like someone who's like reading novels. It might just be like, you know, a mom who's like really into reading Nicholas Sparks, and like that's fine.
Well, that's
fine too.
This is why I always try to get at when we talk to authors about the industry, because it is this kind of, you market yourself. The big presses do not market your books anymore. They have shrugged off that responsibility, and then they shrug their shoulders when the sales are low and they make no money and lose money on the book or the investment. Think of like the genres that are being absolutely completely neglected right now. There are just only a few genres that you can even publish books in. Most of it is, well, mostly you can get if you walk into a bookstore, any bookstore, even like the major chains.
In like fiction, or
I mean all of it. So even in like, there's a couple options of fiction. There's only a few options where you can get this kind of second, third gen immigrant story. That's literally all that's published, or, you know, a few other, but like the entire genres are just being neglected from this area. Then you could get political nonfiction is basically the only nonfiction you're allowed to get published, or they'll bother publishing because they think that's what sells, and that's what's sold for the last couple years. But even now, if you look at the numbers, like that is going down. All these types of like there's just, and not just that, you talk about the political polarization. So like most of publishing seems that they only care about marketing to one half of the country, one half of the audience. And then they're just completely neglecting, actually actively shunning the other half of the audience that they could get for book sales. So again, sales don't seem to matter to these companies anymore. They seem to be prioritizing something else. You guys can take a wild guess as to what you think that is. You know, they seem to be prioritizing things other than publishing books for people to buy. They're publishing books to what they think is changing the world. That's one of the issues with it. But it's also like, you know, we're becoming more illiterate. Like literacy rates peaked in the 60s in this country and have gone down ever since. So we have an illiterate country that, I mean, you've seen this in classrooms, dude. I have college students at community college levels, like they cannot read and write. Like they cannot read and write. Like it's impossible for them. But somehow they're sitting in a college 101 English class, you know, like somehow they're sitting here. And it's like, okay. And I get they're not marketing to that demographic, sure, you know, the illiterate, but like these used to be cool. Like it used to be cool to have read the latest hot book and know about it and talk about it. You know what I mean? And, you know, John Waters has made this argument, you know, 2 decades ago and shit like that. Plenty of people. But there is this cultural irrelevancy around books, novels, poetry has been going on even longer than novels, but like it's incredible. And I've been going on a Harold Bloom kick recently, as I always do, because this is a Harold Bloom podcast. I've just been watching a lot of his YouTube interviews, a lot of like his essays, and he was saying all of this in the 80s and 90s, and it's only been proven correct in terms of what we're dealing with now.
The thing is, like, I can't help but feel like there's a lot out there that I would really enjoy. Like, whether or not it's, like,
I mean, I buy the
great.
ones that are hyped. Like, I just bought Otessa Masagu's, whatever her big novel, My Year of Rest and Relaxation or whatever it is.
What is it?
I just bought hers. It's sitting on my stack of to read. I'm about to pick it up in a couple weeks here, depending on our reading schedule and everything else going on. But like I have it on there. I'm interested. Like I'm interested to participate in the cultural milieu of novels and publishing and poetry and who's writing what and what's good, what's terrible, who's publishing it. That's
Yeah,
what
I'd
this
be
whole
curious
podcast is
about that
about.
one.
Like.
I'd read
You and I
that.
do that. Yeah, let's add it to the list because I have it sitting here. Why not? We'll read it for the podcast. Listeners can tell us if they want us to read Otessa. I hear she's good. I've read
I
interviews
don't
with her.
even fucking know anything about her. Like, see, I feel like I'm so out of the loop on fiction too, and I only hear about like the Pulitzer winner and every other
What's what I mean? Everything
week.
you're
My
interested.
sister's texting me about like some book that she
You're
just read, or like some Sally Rooney shit, or
well, even I get that too with both genres. Like friends will text me or people will send me stuff. I've never fucking heard of it, like kind of thing.
Well, and that
And you
it
and me,
pumps you up. Like,
yeah,
also,
well, you and
like,
me are people that actually follow the field too. Like, our social media followings and like stuff like that, things we follow are customized to the things we're interested in, So we follow book stuff, we follow publishers, we follow magazines. And, it's just, we're still out of the loop because everything is more niche and more popular than ever for some. It's this crazy fucking thing. I don't know how it
yeah, I
happened.
don't know. It's just there's so much. It's so hard to sift through.
There's so much, but so much of it is. I mean, I get it, So like, if you're writing,
And it's not all
YA,
going to be great. There are going to be some
Yeah.
stinkers.
That's why I always get frustrated. And, I get frustrated because I'm in the process of soliciting agents and stuff. And, I've gotten a couple letters, responses that are like, oh, we like this, but, like that kind of. And my opinion, listeners can chime in on this. Like, I think that's worse than just a straight up rejection. I would rather be straight up rejected than having like, this is really good, but, like kind of like, I'm like, no, just tell me it's fucking awful and you don't want it. Like, I don't want to hear that it's good, but like, like I don't need that. Like, fuck. But anyway, it just irritates me because I'm just like, all right, like, if you all know this market so well, then like, why is everything fucking collapsing? Like, then why are you not selling fucking books? Like, if you know this so well, like, why are you not selling books? It's because they don't know. They're making it up as they go along. But anyway, enough of that. Even now, we do something like The Great Gatsby. We think something like The Great Gatsby would get published today, or would it get passed over by the geniuses that know the market so well?
Honestly, I don't know. For this one, I don't know.
I would say no.
I mean, well, I think for some obvious reasons.
And I mean
it
right
might be
now. I don't mean,
excluded.
like, I don't mean like 5 years ago or 10 years ago or, whatever, the 90s. I mean literally right now, and literally the most censorship that I've ever lived through in my life, where like I do not think that a book like this would get published. I mean, so speaking of authors, genres that are just completely vapid, like there's just nothing taking the place. I'm a huge Vonnegut guy. There's nobody writing like that. There's nobody filling that void of like the men that like Vonnegut kind of thing. And Vonnegut wrote mostly for men, and so okay, I get that, right? It's a more narrow market than like everybody type thing, but like, yeah, I wish somebody would be writing like that. I wish, but again, like maybe they are. They're just not getting published in the mainstream areas. You're not getting in the main magazines. You're not getting in the major presses. You have to go to independent small presses that can't get books into Amazon and can't get books into the local stores and stuff like that because they just don't have the resources, time, staff. We're letting it happen. And this, everybody listening to this, if you are letting this happen, if you are letting literature be destroyed, I'm just so sick of it. Like, do something. Try to not let it happen. Like, if you have any position, agent, editor, publisher, if you're just a fucking intern at the publishing house, like, do what you can to try and make this thing cool again. Try and make it like culturally relevant, and stop like making yourself irrelevant and losing money. I don't know what is going on, but, and if you look at the movies that are being made of books, the big bestsellers get movies. In the last 5-6 years, the big bestsellers, of course, get movies made. You know, Where the Crawdad Sings, these type of thing, right? They get movies made. But even then, like, most of the movies, even most of the crime movies and things like that are being made, are being based off of books written 50, 60 years ago, because the publishing is just not filling this market that people were willing to spend money on. Crime novels, you know, the kind of stuff. And those tend to be a little bit more masculine. They don't always tend to be, but, you know, those types of things. It's like incredible. Like, I was seeing that, like, the Coen brothers are doing a Ross McDonald novel. That's their next project. They're doing a Zebra Striped Hearse, which is one of my favorite Ross McDonald books. That book was published in the fucking 60s, dude. Like, that book was published like 60 years ago, and like, we have no crime novels that can fill that or even come close to that now to make a movie of. It's incredible. And I think it just shows how terrible, like, where the industry is. We're culturally irrelevant is where we are. But I don't want to start this off all depressed. We should move off of this topic. The state of publishing. And I'm relatively inexperienced in it because, again, like, I can't break through to that. So, you know, don't take my word for it, listeners. You know, I'm a fucking, you know, who the fuck are we?
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Inner.
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
Who the fuck are we, Andy?
We're fucking heavy bored. And I'm Andrew Whitstuff.
I am just so fucked.
And today we're doing F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel, The Great Gatsby. Another one that everybody has heard of. Everyone's heard of this. And if you haven't heard of it, you live under a rock. Or you're just dead. But even then, everybody that was born after 40-something knew this book.
Yeah.
The movies... I was looking it up. There's only been like 6 movie versions of this, which I was surprised of.
I'm surprised that there was that many, honestly.
Well, it's such a popular book that I'm surprised there was so few, quite honestly. I thought there would be more. But the big ones are the one in 74.
Really? I'm thinking like...
Thinking the Leo one in 2013.
No, I never really looked into it, I guess, because I was just thinking, like, how many film adaptations are there of, like, you know, the people that we would associate with, like, modernist authors? And there probably are a lot more than I'm aware of that were all coming out. Yep. I was just wondering, like, does A Farewell to Arms have a movie adaptation? Like, of course it does, so.
Hemingway has a lot, and he got a lot in the 60s and 70s when, like, all the people that, like, grew up reading his stuff were, like, still, like, oh, let's make movie. Like, Francis Ford Coppola and stuff was loved Hemingway and would, like, I think he wrote a few screen adaptations of his stuff when he was still a screenwriter and not a director yet, but, yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting kind of excited about my year of rest and relaxation.
Dude, I've heard interviews with her. She seems great. Otessa, shout out to Otessa. Otessa, come on the pod. Come on the pod. We'd love to chat. Dude, she doesn't give a fuck. She doesn't use social media. She literally, like, does not go along with she's one of the few big figures who I think is speaking out a little bit at the state of publishing, at the state of what's happening to our art field, you know? She's doing that. And again, you know, she doesn't get bogged down by the people criticizing her either because she doesn't see it because she's not online and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, and I've heard interviews with her. Like, yeah, she seems great. She talks about some of her biggest influences are like people like Bukowski and shit. I was like, oh yeah, I got to read this girl. Like, I got to read her shit. So I bought the book. Maybe, yeah, okay, we'll add it to the list here. We'll do it on this podcast, listeners. How about that?
Just doing a quick scan of eBay.
That book has been a top seller, but again, it's because the marketing has been pushed for that. So, you know, her first couple books didn't sell as well as this one, but, you know.
Her most recent is Lapvona.
Haven't gotten there yet. I just bought the big popular one everyone's been talking about like the last 5 years or so. And you can tell she's been very inspired by the kind of transgressive writers in like the 80s and 90s that like came before, you know? Those types of guys writing then, and you can tell that she's very into that. And I mean, dude, that used to be great. Like, this is what I'm like. We talked about this. We've always talked about it with the Stephen King, the sewer scene and shit. Like, this kind of books used to be fair game for the worst shit imaginable. Like, you used to go to them for the most shocking, disturbing, like, trashy elements possible. And that is being systemically wiped out, literally. You're not allowed to publish it in books anymore. And this is due to editors, agents, publishing houses. This is it. That's what I mean. Everything has gotten worse, and we're still insisting it hasn't. And we can see the numbers. The industry is failing. They're basically, at this point, it's straight up abuse of writers when they're taking these exploitive contracts where they don't give you any marketing and take all the money for your book. It's incredible that we've reached this point. And one of the interesting things about those statistics, Colleen Hoover, that romance writer who self-publishes all her stuff, she literally was in had 8 of the top 20 books this past year.
Damn.
Like, literally, meaning she was selling millions of copies of this self-published romance stuff. You know, we're not big romance people. We don't really read those. Although it'd be interesting to do a romance novel on the pod. Listeners, send in Rex. We'd like to, we have no idea about romance genre, so I don't know. I was thinking we'd do like a Danielle Steele book or something just to whet our appetite. I don't know. Listeners can chime in, see where we should head in the romance direction and do a heavy board episode. But yeah, man, it's, I think it just shows what's happening. Like, self-publishing, like I said, used to be a laughing stock. It's not so much a laughing stock anymore. Even if you're no good, if you find the audience, you know, you're not a literary writer, there's still an audience out there that clearly isn't being served. Clearly the current romance novels are not serving the audience like Colleen Hoover's are. You know what I mean? And I think of this with a lot of self-published stuff that I see online and like men's adventure fiction. I'm not even a huge fan of the genre, but, you know, every once in a while I like to read a stupid book, you know? Yeah. And, those just don't exist anymore. You have to, like, you can barely find them if you go into a Barnes and Noble. Like, it's all about Katniss Everdeen and all this kind of shit. And, like, there is no men's adventure fiction for people to read on the bus, you know.
Tris Pryor.
Which is why people are going
Divergent.
backwards. They're reading stuff and making movies of books that were published 160, 50 years ago. Like, you know, White Noise, right? Noah Baumbach just did White Noise, and I'm not a huge fan of that book. I'm not a big Don DeLillo fan, period, but, like, that book was published literally, like, 40 years ago. Like, that book was published 40 years ago, and we just made a movie about it, and we made a movie so late about it because, like, the humor doesn't hold up, the irony doesn't hold up, and I don't know if you watched that or not, but the book itself, I think, is a boring book that doesn't hold up that much, but, like, I'm sure that means the story in the movie didn't either, although I haven't watched it yet. I'm not a big Noah Baumbach guy. I think he's incredibly boring. Yeah,
it's not for me.
I liked parts of Marriage Story and stuff like that. I think parts of that were really good, but that was because the actors were really good. And then, like, I think, and, you know, he writes good dialogue. You know, he knows how to write dialogue and things like that. But his direction is just, you know, he always kind of misses the mark for me. But I'll watch that eventually, I'm sure. White Noise. I just haven't had time and don't care enough to be, oh, I really want to watch this. Oh, I really got to watch it. I'm always behind on all that shit anyway, dude. Like, I don't keep up with shit. I'm listening to music from, like, 3 years ago because, like, I just never keep up with it. I have to, like, I'm, like, 3 years behind. But it's new to me. So we're doing The Great Gatsby today. We've preambled. Good long time.
So I'm really hung up on buying this fucking book now. I'm like,
what
I gotta
book?
buy it.
Yeah, Tessa book?
Yeah. Whatever.
You can find cheap copies of The Great Gatsby everywhere. You can go into a used bookstore. There's probably like 100 little ratted, you know, tattered up paperbacks where you can find a copy of this. It's a short book. It reads pretty quick. My version, I have this kind of cheap print-on-demand copy because I bought this kind of compilation of all 4 of Fitzgerald's novels, because the only one I'd read before this was The Great Gatsby. But, you know, I hadn't read The Great Gatsby since like high school, first couple years of college, so it's been a while. I had forgotten a lot of it besides, like, you know, the 2013 movie. You kind of get your memory jogged and stuff like that. But
I'd tried and failed so many times that I feel like I remember maybe the first couple chapters of the book. They were all pretty familiar to me, even if it had been a long time. But,
did you have to read it in high school?
Nope.
You weren't assigned it and you just didn't do it, or you just were never assigned it?
I was never assigned it.
I was assigned it in high school, and then in college I was assigned it a few times.
I was never once assigned this book, not once.
Huh. Interesting.
Which I think maybe I could have appreciated it more in that kind of context.
Yeah, and this originally was published in 1925. It was Fitzgerald's 3rd novel, I believe.
Was it?
I believe so.
I mean, I assume that your collection is like in chronological order.
No, it isn't actually. Because it's a cheap like print on demand, so I don't think somebody took the time to do that. You know what I mean? But I just bought it because it was $20 and I got all 4 of his books, and I've read 2 of them so far. I read The Gatsby for this one, and then I read This Side of Paradise, which was his first novel.
Yeah.
And I still have Tales of the Jazz Age. It looks like it goes
This Side of Paradise, then we have
Beautiful and the Damned.
The Beautiful and the Damned and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And then Gatsby, and then Tender is the Night. Oh, and I guess there's also one called Winter Dreams.
Winter Dreams. I think that's a story collection.
And that's in 22.
Because Benjamin Button is like a long short story kind of novella too, and
yeah,
I think that was in one of those collections.
Probably.
But his 4 novels are Tales of the Jazz Age, The Beautiful and the Damned, This Side of Paradise, and The Gatsby. And then his unfinished one is The Love of the Last Tycoon, that he like died before he finished. Although I've heard the first part that he actually finished is quite good.
That's I think I read something about that too.
But you know, I haven't read it myself, so listeners, dive in. But this is a good place to start. This is the first time you've read it, Soph. Thoughts?
Yep. So, I have historically not really enjoyed what little of Fitzgerald I have read. I think he's one of the ones that I tried time and time again, you know, when I was a young, strapping, new English major. I was like, I'm an English major, I'm going to read Fitzgerald. I read Fitzgerald now. Yeah. And I don't know if it was like I had been too broken down after reading The Sun Also Rises and being like, I don't know if this is for me. I think, you know, I tried to read Tender is the Night, and every person I've said that to is like, oh, God, no. Like, why start there? Which, oddly enough, I do have a copy of. And, you know, I think I had maybe that sort of in my head. Like, I was aware of Fitzgerald as someone who was, like, clearly talented as a writer, but whose writing didn't particularly interest me. And whether it was because, I don't know, I think maybe some of it is just like the cultural knowledge of knowing The Great Gatsby, right? Like, I went into this essentially already knowing the story, knowing
it's been elevated
cultural
to like legendary
significance of this story, knowing that, like, you know, when did that movie come out? When did the most recent?
2013 was the Lerman Leo DiCaprio version.
Didn't love that. Which, you know, isn't really about Fitzgerald at all, whether or not I liked the movie that his book was made into. I was sort of in the middle. I liked it more at the end. I think it's a good book. It is. I wasn't like super thrilled to be reading it, but it was a quick read. And it was like one of these weird situations where I find so many of the characters so detestable that I just find myself kind of like recoiling a little bit as I like read certain parts, but not in a way that's like, oh, this is bad, but like in a, ugh, like this person disgusts me. And it took a while in the book for me to figure out whether or not that was like the appropriate response. But overall, I mean, it's a good, obviously it's like a, you know, it's a great novel. I'm glad to have read it. It's not one that I felt especially moved by, though. It didn't tear me up like I wanted it to. And that kind of, I think, disappointed me. And I don't know how much of that is because, like, I already knew what was coming. Or because I already knew... or like I was expecting it or something. Like I was expecting to be broken up at the end, like you're broken up in like the age of innocence, like in, maybe not in the same way. Again, we'll talk about this because we have two different maybe feelings about what kind of story this is. Even like in a House of Mirth kind of way, I'd hope to be like, I'd hope to feel greater emotion as I wound down, but I did not.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a tragedy, but not in that heart-wrenching kind of way.
Yeah.
That you would get from somebody like an Edith Wharton.
I don't know, it feels like watching a car crash and then finding out that there were no people inside and everything's fine.
And I think that's mainly, we'll get into this, but I think that might be because of how Fitzgerald chose to have the narrator tell the story as like being a character while relaying what's happening, so that like the emotional resonance that's happening between Daisy and Gatsby you don't really see firsthand like you would in a Wharton novel type thing. But yeah, I would say this is definitely Fitzgerald's best work. There's definitely a reason why this is the book that everybody remembers and not like his other ones, you know. Most people didn't even know The Curious Case of Benjamin Button existed before the Brad Pitt movie and stuff like that. You know, he was not as famous
that fucking
for this.
movie, dude.
Yeah, very weird.
Fucking hated it. I had to see it with my family. I fucking hated it.
But this is
Don't show me this wrinkly old man baby.
Yeah, that was the weirdest part, dude. Because the CGI wasn't quite there yet, and they had like Brad Pitt looking like 20 years
so
old,
fucking
and
long,
then they had
and
like,
there's so much like voiceover, and I was like, get me the fuck out of here.
Yeah. So like this is the one, and the reason it is, like Sophie said, it's short. It's the shortest of his novels. It reads very fast for those of you that are interested and haven't read this already, or want to reread it. Because again, I don't think I would have thought of it the way I'm thinking of it now. I don't think I did think of it the way I'm thinking of it now when I had to read it in high school and things like that. Like, you know, high school, the teacher's reading out of the kind of textbook where they're telling you, you know, the color green on the dock is symbolism for bullshit, and then like T.J. Eckelberger's eyes are like God's eyes.
Well, there was a lot of all of the symbolism.
Right.
It's
And
a heavily symbolic book.
I don't necessarily, I mean, I guess they could say that, but I guess it's just my personal, I hate when people start pulling these threads that are maybe there, but we don't know, and they're just going to pull them out as like, this is a theory on it, and this is actually how you should interpret. I'm like, well, you know, we can get theoretical, but yeah, it's hard for me. You know, I'm such a cynic about this kind of formalist, like what matters is the book in front of you. What matters is, you know, the poem in front of you, that like, when we start going into the realm of what's it symbolizing, I just feel like we're wasting time because we're never going to get to the end of that, you know?
I mean, I feel like it's so obviously and intentionally there. I feel like that's like one of Fitzgerald's things. Like, he's so... like, you can feel it, him trying to build meaning through, like, these small moments, these little motifs that occur.
And it may be why this is his most successful book, because when I was reading that, he does something similar in his first book, This Side of Paradise, which is basically autofiction, but like he doesn't quite capture it. He's trying to do these kind of like symbolic gestures or these little scenes that would lay onto like a bigger layered piece of like, you know, symbolism. It was like he doesn't quite achieve it. But in Gatsby, everything of his quirks just works. Like, you know, better than the other stuff. But overall, yeah, I read it very fast. I thought it was great. I'm with Sophie that the ending is a little long because we have this kind of Nick Carraway carrying on the story after, and like that last chapter, I was just a little bit like, all right, do we really need to have Nick Carraway telling all this stuff?
Well, I think some of it felt important to me to tie up. Because I think it was also intended to be revealing. Like, if you hadn't figured out the kind of people that we were dealing with in the first 8 chapters, it was in chapter 9 that you figured it out.
Yeah, and when I was reading this, I started noticing things that I would see in more contemporary writers that were clearly inspired by Fitzgerald. The way he structures gossip and things like that in the novel got me a very much like Bret Easton Ellis, American Psycho vibe kind of thing. And I think Bret Easton Ellis has very publicly said that Great Gatsby is one of his favorite books. He's read it more than any other book. And it's clearly a huge inspiration to his entire career. So like things like that, you can see people, writers over the last 100 years since this was published, be inspired by it. I mean, I think this book was actually a flop when it came out, wasn't it? Like it didn't sell.
No idea.
I think it didn't sell. And there's a rumor, I don't know if this is true, listeners can check, there's a rumor that like the story, sometimes the legend matters more than the actual reality, but like the legend is that this was a flop and it got this kind of revival during World War II because when they were handing out books to the soldiers, like American soldiers, they would hand out supplies, so they'd hand out cartons of cigarettes, chocolate bars, whatever it is that they're handing out to the soldiers. They would also hand them paperbacks, and they would print these like cheap paperbacks for the soldiers that had like these 2 short novels in them, and like one of them was The Great Gatsby. It was like 2 novels in a single book. And then, because that was like one of the few books they were handing out to soldiers, it got passed around, the barracks and stuff, and then everybody ended up reading it and like loving it, and it got this huge revival kind of post World War II. That's where we saw a movie version that still exists, I think in 1949, and then the rest is history type thing. It got kind of canonized in this way, and it's a lot of books. When we did Moby Dick, this is kind of what happened to Moby Dick. Like, although that wasn't handed out to soldiers, at least that's not the legend of it. Scholars kind of got obsessed with it. 40 years after it was published and discovered the merits and like, well, we overlooked this one kind of thing. That happens a lot because why? Well, because we're only human, right? Like we can only, and this is why we encourage you to buy a copy of these books, keep them on your shelf, read it again later in your life. Because when you're 30, this book's going to mean something different to you than when you're 18, forced to read it in high school or even younger in a lot of these schools, When I was a 14, 15-year-old, do I think I would have noticed what I noticed this time? Absolutely not. Like, absolutely not. But yeah, overall, I liked it. And you said you didn't hate it, but you weren't crazy about it?
I wasn't in love. Well, it was just, I was trying to figure, I just hated the characters from the beginning. I don't think you're
All of
supposed
them?
to like them. No, not all of them.
See,
I was
it's
skeptical
interesting.
of Nick at first. I was
For
skeptical of
me-
our narrator.
Yeah. That's a lot of scholarship I saw here. I was obsessed with Nick Carraway. But, like, for me, I was almost, like, rooting for Gatsby
Well, I think that's sort of...
when I was reading it.
Yeah, I feel like we're
Which
almost...
is, like,
there's
maybe,
this
like,
weird thing. I think he's, like, a tragic figure, but also...
Not quite anti-hero, but
not quite unlikable.
right, but there's, like,
But
the
there's something
charm.
kind of repulsive about him
Yeah.
that I think that they're kind of explained. Those things are explained to us throughout the novel in various ways through the eyes of Nick. But especially when we are not supposed to like Tom, who is just kind of like a racist asshole.
Yeah, I think his
and,
first
like, a
first dialogue is
womanizer
about the
and-
white race.
Oh yeah, it
yeah.
is. But right after that,
That's like
there
his
was this
first
quote
dialogue.
that
Yeah.
I was like, oh yeah. It was in the first chapter, and we get from Nick, there was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. I feel like this is a theme that comes up, and that happens right after the the race relations passage.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this was published in 25, guys, so literally segregation was a thing, right? Literally literally professors at Harvard were publishing race science garbage, okay? That's what was happening in 1925. So, white people were, still doing this kind of superiority thing, and, people argue it's still going on, but, it was really bad. It was really
bad. Think of it this way. We were in between two world wars, the second of which was a Holocaust.
Yeah. So there's that. Yeah, but even in the 1925, right, this is supposed to make you think that actually Tom's not a good guy. Because even in 1925, right, if you were obsessed with this stuff, people were like, all right, kind of okay. And now it's even, people are like, what the fuck's wrong with you now? Yeah. But in 1925, it was already kind of starting to be like, okay, dude, talk about these Harvard professors, writing books on eugenics or whatever the fuck it was.
Sure.
In the 20s and 30s, but...
Yeah, but immediately... we get this sort of theme of complacency or contentment, not just always being too little, always being a little bit bored or jaded or looking for the right word. But
well, Nick Carraway, and I think the reason that he did this kind of Nick Carraway's narrating it as he's watching the events, and then sometimes he's being told after, he's telling us that after he remembers them or something. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because his character is lower in class than Daisy and Tom and Gatsby and all that. Even though we learn Gatsby's faking it, but it's he's almost judging them as he's narrating the story to us. He's giving us little things about how they look disinterested or bored with what they're saying. They don't actually believe what they're saying. He's giving us these kind of narrative, kind of his own input into what's happening in the story here. Some of the descriptions of the Jordan Baker character I think were pretty good too, with Nick describing what it was and their kind of weird kind of love that wasn't actually love, kind of convenience of kissing each other. And they say kissing, but it was 1925, right? You couldn't say they were fucking, but you couldn't print that in a book, which is nuts to somebody like us that grew up in where that wasn't a thing. But yeah, all that good stuff. We liked it. All right.
Oh, here it is. I was thinking, we get these snippets of him judging it, but it also opens with him talking about, this advice that his father had given him a long time ago. And that advice is, whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you have had. In consequence, and this is a little bit later, in consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores.
Yeah, one of the lines in that second, really third paragraph of the opening chapter, reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope.
Infinite hope, which I think we quickly learn is going to be sort of an important, I guess a theme, but really only for the most part, I think, in a few places, mostly in Gatsby's world, right? He is like a tragic hopeful. He won't let go of hope. He is hopeful to maybe a great detriment.
Yeah. And even after that, we'd get the idea of Carraway giving his judgments on this, reserving judgment as a matter of infinite hope. The very next paragraph, he says, only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. And it is, so already we get in this kind of, Carraway is skeptical. He's skeptical, and it's interesting, he's really the one that changes through the book, where he's extremely skeptical of Gatsby and then actually really admires him towards the end, kind of thing. I guess we could talk about that, but
yeah. Well, he even goes on, no, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men.
And he does, I guess I'm saying, like, Kerouac is lower class, but not quite poverty, you know, like he's not like middle class, he's still upper class, but not as rich as these extremely rich, you know, Buchanans and Gatsbys and things.
Well, yeah, he's trying to be a bondsman, right?
Because he's not so rich, he still has to work. He's working in finance. He probably went to Ivy League schools and all that kind of stuff, but like he's still not quite rich enough to have elaborate parties or horses, or you know, he's renting a little small house where in amongst all these big houses, so he's a little out of place, and he kind of is constantly reminded of that as he's interacting with these people. And he's a little bit disgusted because there is a little bit of judgment in, you know, in what he's doing here.
Yeah,
and that's why we said, like, the very first paragraph, he's talking about judgment being infinite hope, and then I think this is set up, at least structurally, to give us this kind of change in Nick Carraway where he's very almost admires Gatsby for what he did, how big the lie was, and how much he was able to carry it with him. But I just thought it's interesting we started off with that, yeah. And from there, the book fucking flies, dude. I mean, I was flying through it.
I think I was bored up through... It wasn't until, like, I got to a chapter that I hadn't actually read. I think that maybe was part of it, because even if I didn't entirely remember everything that happened, it felt very familiar. But maybe it was around, like, chapter 4 where I became more interested. And at this point, I already kind of hate the people that I've met in the book, including Daisy, who I find kind of just as detestable as Tom.
Yeah.
She's also kind of described as like this, I don't know if like this is like a Fitzgerald thing or, you know, if it's just this character, but she's like just this sort of manic pixie girl, you know.
Very aloof.
Yeah, she feels like a kind of hollow character to me.
Yeah. The big thing I noticed was on my version, page 591, but it's kind of when he first meets, when he's going to Daisy's house for lunch or whatever, or dinner, and this is...
The first time?
Yeah, it's
when
still in the
them?
first chapter. It's kind of towards the end of chapter 1, right before the last break. But there's when he's talking to her and she's telling him about her kid.
Yeah.
She's like, "Oh yes," she looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. 'All right,' I said. 'I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool.' You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything." Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. "Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated." And she said, yeah, the instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt that the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Things like that, right? You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow.
Yeah, but it's also about being a part of this, you know, for lack of a better term, like rich people club. right? Like they're sort of complacent
club.
in their
Yeah.
in their like comfortable life and want excitement and can't get it.
And we talked
And-
about this a little bit with like Lana Del Rey episode where she has things that touch on this. You know, you would like to be like, oh, this rich person has an ideal life, but you know, everybody has their own depression and things that they deal because they're human still, even if you're a rich human. All that. And it, you know, it's kind of laughable. And this was a trend, I guess, in the 20s and stuff, this kind of like upper class. They call it satire. Like, this is what they said with when we did Wharton's House of Mirth and stuff. Like, everybody calls it satire, but like, isn't it just like a real depiction of like these people don't give a fuck?
Well, yeah, I
about
think there's
anybody below them?
I think
Like,
there's a level of commentary there.
yeah. I'm just like, is it satire if you're just showing what it is? Like, these people don't give a fuck about like people below them, like literally walk all over them, and it doesn't matter at all because they just are isolated from the consequences. And I guess we can laugh at that and scorn that, but like, I'd be like, that's just reality. Maybe that's, you know, whatever. But yeah, this is when I decided, like right here in this moment with the Daisy and Nick kind of giving his narration around how Daisy's face is looking, how like he felt the basic insincerity of what she had said, kind of stuff. Like she doesn't even mean what she's saying. She doesn't even know what she's saying. She's just kind of aloof and laying there on like a chaise.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I was like, okay, like having Nick as narrator makes this more interesting because he's inserting judgments as he's telling this. And as we get this kind of gossiping, and that's what most of the dialogue is in this, right? Like the entire drama around this is, yeah, the affair and the murder, but then like, it's mostly gossip, right?
Yep.
Didn't you hear Gatsby did this? You know, this kind of thing. And I remember listening to a David Mamet interview. People that don't know, although probably most people listening know him, right? Famous American playwright, Pulitzer Prize winner, very good writer. He just made this statement in an interview about dialogue where he said, gossip is dialogue, where he just said, you know, Tom says bippity boppity boo. He's like, Sharon says this. He's like, that's as good as it gets. Okay, that's as good as dialogue and any dramatic thing gets. He's like, it should always be this kind of gossip between characters, lies, misunderstandings, this kind of talking about another character in the room. All of that. He's like, that is where true drama lies. And I guess he's talking mostly stage plays and stuff, but still it works in all kind of fiction, dramatized things. And I think it works here too with this kind of gossip. He was very good at that. You know, Wharton's very good at that too, the kind of gossipy talk back and forth. She was a little deeper, I think, with some of her stuff, but yeah. I like it. I mean, I loved it. I was texting Sophie, like, as soon as I blew through, like, the first 20 pages, I was like, damn, this reads fast as shit.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, yeah, for being a novel of the 20s, it's not a difficult read, I would say. Yeah, we also, I don't know if you want to talk about Gatsby's first appearance, maybe we can just briefly say, like, there is, like, this famous moment, or a moment that I think of as famous because it just feels like a famous literary image of Gatsby looking out across the Long Island Sound at the dock where Daisy and Tom's house is, and sees this green light. And obviously, you know, Nick is telling us all this, that he's witnessing the man who lives next to him. We haven't named him yet. Stretching out his arms in the dark toward this green light, this tiny green light. And that, I think, is like the beginning. Like, you know.
And then we get the...
Yeah, go ahead.
We get the first interaction with Nick and Gatsby in my version on page 605, but it's in chapter 3.
Yeah, it's in the chapter where party is.
Yeah, where Nick gets invited to the party first, and at one point he's talking, you know, the famous thing is, at a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. Your face is familiar, he said politely. Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war? I said, why, yes. I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion. I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before. We talked for a moment about some wet, gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound. What time? Any time that suits you best. It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. Having a gay time now? She inquired. Much better. I turned again to my new acquaintance. This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there. I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance, and this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. For a moment he looked at me as if he had failed to understand. I'm Gatsby, he said suddenly. What? I exclaimed. Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host. He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. And I've just highlighted that part where it's like he's describing Gatsby's smile, like just the charm of this person, this person's presence sitting near him. Kind of like understandingly, but much more than understandingly. Rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it.
Eternal reassurance.
Yeah.
Sounds like eternal hope. Insistent that everything will work out.
Yeah. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant. And then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor.
Which is also like, comparing that to our first image of Gatsby as like a man with his arms outstretched and supposedly he says, I thought I saw his arms trembling or his hands trembling, and like he seems almost desperate and like he wants to be alone.
Yeah, I think the word desperate is appropriate here because I think it shows the desperation, like what's behind not even just wealthy people like Tom or somebody. Like there's a desperation to many of these characters.
Yeah. It really also doesn't...
To be something they aren't, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. It also doesn't take very long for Nick to begin to dislike him.
It's when he starts inserting himself into Nick's life to get Daisy.
Mm-hmm.
That Nick starts being like, well, this is rude, this is strange. Like,
yeah, it's when he's like, I need you to have tea with Jordan Baker. I need you to have tea with Mrs. Baker so that she can tell you something that I won't tell you. Like, and it's really weird. There's something really strange about him. And there's something that is also very imposing about him. Not about, like, I'm not talking about, like, the figure, like we would maybe think of, like, Tom as the more physically imposing character. But imposing himself on other people's lives. And sort of forcing other people to play a role in his sort of race to acquire whatever it is he's seeking.
yeah. Yeah, there's just this idea of the desperation, this kind of... And, like, the gossip around everything.
But also kind of an inability to see how he actually affects other people or how his actions are going to affect other people.
And this idea of Nick, when he says at the end of chapter 3 here, everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people that I have ever known. What do we think? Is Nick Carraway honest?
I mean, I found him to be a trustworthy narrator. Except for, like, I mean, I found him to be a little bit egotistical at the beginning. In his own descriptions of himself, but as it went on, yeah, I think I trusted him as a narrator. Which surprised me because of statements like that.
And this is a technique, and I know there's lots of stuff said about Nick Carraway as narrator and scholarship over the last 100 years, but it's like, when you're reading a novel, one of the techniques you can use as a writer for a reader to experience is readers don't have a choice but to trust your narrator, right? If you're taking the novel seriously and engaging in it, reading it, you're trusting the person telling you the story. You know, even
Well,
if
right.
it's a
You can
narrator.
intentionally create
And then you can subvert that. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's
an
what I was getting at, yeah.
unreliable narrator, right?
Right. You can subvert their expectations through that. So the narrator's telling you something and then you show them something else,
Right.
kind of thing. You can use that to your advantage. And it doesn't quite what happens here, but it's like along those lines. Just, you know, for the writers that, the book people that are listening with the structure of this.
Well, what do you mean? Because did you find him to be trustworthy? Or did
I
you
did.
have like a similar reaction to me where it was like you were skeptical at first and then less skeptical? Because I felt skeptical of him at first.
I didn't feel skeptical of him really at any time, besides maybe when he started talking very highly of himself. Like, this is one of the few honest
Those
people
were
that
the
I've
places.
ever known.
Yeah.
It is interesting because I personally struggle with some of this too, whereas like I really don't, like, it's hard for me to not be honest about things. Like, it eats me alive kind of thing, you know what I mean? I don't know if that has to do with how you're raised or whatever, Catholic guilt, whatever it is, like this kind of like, I can't willingly lie to people. Like, it's very hard for me to do that kind of thing. So I get where he's like, he believes himself to be honest, but, you know, you can still lie to yourself. But, you know,
Right.
Are there moments in here that we could point to where he's lying to himself? I think we could make an argument, but then I was like, you know, then you go to the actual structure. You know, when you're reading a book, you're buying in, like, you're being immersed into this person's world, into this world. You're creating a new world, even if it's fictional, right? Even if it resembles the real world, it's still like a fictional kind of. So you just kind of roll with it, you know. I'm just never as skeptical of narrators.
Well, yeah, he
I
engages
guess it's just
in
naive. I guess
virtually
I'm just
no
naive enough
people-pleasing
to-
behaviors
Yeah.
in this book. Like, he is not, I don't know, putting on a charm for anybody or...
And he seems to be portrayed as forgetful. Like, there's a few chapters where he starts them off with, oh, before I forget, this happened a couple weeks ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then that scene in the apartment in the city when he is all that commotion going on between Gatsby, Tom, and Daisy, and he just sits there and goes, oh, I just remembered today's my birthday, kind of
Right.
thing. It's just like, oh, okay, dude, like, you forgot about it. Like, yeah, all right. But, like, yeah, things like that, maybe a little disingenuous, but, you know, we can get nitpicky, but yeah. Overall, I liked Carraway, and I think, like you said, I kind of liked him more at the end, too, when he was just kind of so flabbergasted that nobody cared, kind of thing. And again, I think that does kind of show his honesty in a way, where he thought these people
Well,
that
and he
said
was
they were
like
friends,
angry at them.
right?
Exactly.
Because
he
these
was
people that
very
said they were
judgmental of those
friends
people.
of Gatsby weren't actually friends, you know. And this is very common if you get into like very elite circles, right? You're only a friend as long as somebody needs you, all that kind of stuff. How can they use you when you have something they want,
right.
kind of thing.
And
I've
Daisy
heard horror
has
stories.
disappeared.
Yeah,
She is, you know, I mean, maybe we should like
Yeah,
talk
it's like
about
Daisy next.
the major events, I
Yeah,
guess, of the
yeah.
book.
Let's do. I guess it's really the end of chapter 4 where we get some of the because of the tea and all that.
Oh, right. So like when the tea is about to happen, when Gatsby comes to Nick's house and they're like waiting for Daisy to arrive for this tea, and he like is freaking out. He's losing his fucking mind. He is being
Something I think
like
the
a neurotic,
Leo,
anxious mess.
and something I think the Leo version captured very well. Leo played
Yeah, I
this
can envision
very
him
well
doing
in
that,
that
yeah.
suit in the rain, and just kind of his face and like his kind of motions. You know, the big famous ones. So Leo in 2013, and then Robert Redford in 74 were the big Gatsby figures throughout, you know, American pop culture history. Because, you know, I like that kind of thing, but I kept picturing the Leo scene, because it's a very distinct scene in the Baz Luhrmann version there, with he shows up all soaking wet after he ran through the backyard, the flowers coming in, they make kind of a joke out of it, more so than it is in the book, although Nick is still in the book being like, oh, you didn't think mine was good enough, you know. And I think in the 2013 movie version they actually make it even more extravagant, where like Gatsby brings in his own tea set and stuff. Whereas in the book, he just asks him if he needs a tea
making sure
set.
the lawn is cut, and like he's very concerned with the appearances of the whole thing. But at the same time, he's also like, you know, it's like moments to the time when she's supposed to arrive,
Yeah.
and he's just like throwing up his hands and being like, it's done. She's not coming. It's not worth it. This is a mistake. You know, like nothing's gonna happen. So there is like this weird in those moments, like you see the breakdown of the sort of
And you see this in the
cultivated exterior.
And you see this in the conversation between Jordan Baker, who is like, you know, Nick's kind of love interest at the time, who's friends with Daisy, and then Nick here at the end of chapter 4, after we get this kind of like,
That tea is so awkward.
This is before the tea, but this is right before. This is after he already asked him, but before we see the events of the tea, and Jordan's talking to him, and she's telling him that, like, you know, Gatsby, this is like. He's talking to her. He's like, "What a strange coincidence," I said. But it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Then it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. He wants to know, continued Jordan, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over. The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden. Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a thing? He's afraid. He's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's a regular tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained, and your house is right next door. Oh. I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, went on Jordan, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. And this kind of thing where she's talking about why Gatsby's going to ask him to invite Daisy for tea, and then he's going to show up. He's kind of like organizing a meet cute or something, right? Like this kind of...
but it's like 5 years in the making.
And it's like a psychotic obsession kind of.
It's like it's like there's this part of me that's like doing that unfair, like, no, but like we want him to chase. Like we want him, it's flattering to have someone this in love, right? But then it's also like, this is creepy. Like you went and bought a house so that you could be like a, you know, not to like throw around language, but it's like stalkery.
Right.
It's kind of stalkery behavior, which, you know, but yeah, I don't think here it's intended to be like he's a stalker. It's just like it's really, like you said, obsessively or psychotically obsessive.
But the way it's told, I agree with all that. But like the way it's told is like a romanticizing of that obsession.
Yes.
And there is this kind of, and Sophie and I texted about this a little bit. We should get into it now, I guess. With this kind of, it's a very masculine book. Sophie was texting me about this, and I think that's true. I think it mainly because it's from the point of view of a male narrator, and then we mostly follow this male. Well, and I think that the
male characters feel more real. The female characters in some ways feel a little bit hollow to me, but in a way that may be intentional and maybe some of it is not. Like, you know, it's sort of hard for me to say one way or another. I already sort of said what I think of Daisy, but I think that she's supposed to be kind of a detestable person.
A lot of his female characters are written that way. In This Side of Paradise, it was kind of like that as well. Like the main guy was always kind of disgusted by how aloof and uneducated the women he was around.
Right.
And this was a time when the women were not going to college, right? Princeton was
we know Fitzgerald did not have a happy marriage. Like we know that you know, he was not necessarily kind to women. So like there is, it is hard, I guess, to not see that in the book, and not even not knowing about Fitzgerald, right? Like you can feel that the male characters feel more real or have more depth. They feel like Tom almost feels like the most tangible, like real character to me. Like I can just envision him without having to refer to who played him in a movie or
Right.
like there's something about him that feels like a real character to me, more so than any of the women in the novel.
And this is something I think that isn't mentioned, or it just isn't talked about as honestly in some of the more recent stuff, where there is this level that I think this book captures of that when a man is in love with a woman, there are things that like he would be willing to do in terms of like somebody like Gatsby. Is he willing to like literally commit crimes and lie about everything just to have a chance at what he has been chasing for the last 5 years since this girl he met well before he was shipped off in the army kind of thing, you know what I mean?
Right.
And there's something, it's like a romantic tragedy, I think, to that, like this idea of, yes, a lot of men are willing to do this to get the person that they love or think they love in the case of this.
Yeah.
But even so, I mean, we doubt that he actually loved her. I think he was naive about his chances, considering she was already married to somebody who was actually wealthy and powerful
I
and
think
stuff.
when we learn
But
what his
did he not
motivation in
love her?
chasing her
Was for her to love him.
was, like, I mean, I think when we learn his sort of backstory with her, how they met, how he actually began to pursue her, why she appealed to him, and it wasn't just that she was beautiful, it was that there was something magical about this sort of world that she lived in, that she was particularly wanted by other men, things that essentially increased her value. So
And he
really
couldn't have
early
it, yeah.
on, it was just like you're something valuable that I feel I can't have, and that intrigues me. And then they become tied up in this like brief romance before he goes to the war.
And that's why I kept getting this idea of the love story, with this idea of the romantic love story, where it's everything he did to just have a chance at Daisy. Literally spent years staring at the end of her dock, would host these parties that he couldn't afford just for the chance of her to show up, because he didn't want to just show up to the house, right? Just like with the Kerouac, he had this kind of, he didn't want to be rude, he didn't want to be forcing himself in there, but at the same time he did, right? Because everybody wants what they want to some extent, and then it's
Right. Well, and he wants to acquire her, right? Like she is. I mean, like I feel obnoxious saying this because I feel like I could just like be, in like my college class talking about why this book is anti-women, or like I don't know.
right. Yeah.
And that's not what I'm trying to say. But like I do think he is painted that way, and I think he is painted that way intentionally as like someone who thinks that he loves her, but actually he is just reaching toward this idea of a person that if he could have would somehow increase the value of his world in some way.
But not only that, I would argue, I guess, to push against it is that he doesn't care about the things that he accumulated, really, because he did it all to get her. What he cares about is getting a chance with Daisy, so he's willing to abandon all of that.
Sure, right. When
In a
she comes
moment.
over and finally
Yeah.
sees his stuff, he's like, I don't remember the exact quote, but he's like revaluing everything in his house in relation to her interest in
Right.
it.
Exactly. He only cares about getting her.
And then
he's
there's that
done all of
moment
this.
where
Yeah.
she's like crying over the shirts.
That's
Right.
yeah, let's talk about that.
And to me, I was like, I'm actually not sure how to read this, because I think it's like on some level I'm like, oh, is this her crying over a lost opportunity, and is it a lost opportunity with him, or is it a lost opportunity because what she wants is like nice things, which she has nice things. She's
Right. She has everything he has and more, basically.
yeah, and like for real, and So it's weird. It's like on the one hand, is she sobbing into these shirts because of what she says? They're just so beautiful. I've never seen such beautiful shirts. I'm just so, like, and that's really what she says, right?
Let's read this passage, because I think that was a line that I marked too, because I wanted to talk about it. I'm just on page 627 of my
hold
version.
up. You read. I'm gonna pee real quick.
Yeah, it's right at the end of chapter 5 there. Okay, so he's talking to Nick Carraway here as he's showing Nick and Daisy his house. It's the funniest thing, old sport, he said hilariously. I can't. When I try to. He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. Recovering himself in a minute, he opened for us 2 hulking patent cabinets, which held his massed suits and dressing gowns and ties, and his shirts, piled like bricks in stacks a dozen high. I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall. He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them, one by one, before us. Shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heap mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids, in coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strained sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." And that's the end of that little section there. And my question there is just like, she's not talking about the shirts, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like, but what is she talking about, right? Because she's not.
Well, that's the thing. Okay, so she's crying after he's throwing out these shirts, like literally throwing them there to show what he has, what he does, what he's accomplished.
He's peacocking.
Peacocking, yes. And there's been scholarship on this of the Bowery Bird type, Gatsby's mansion, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, peacocking. But that's why I said, is like, I don't believe Daisy's crying about the shirts here, but all she can manage to say is talk about these shirts. Nobody cares about the shirts, actually.
Well, I think it's not entirely not about the shirts, right? Like, because it's not just that it's Gatsby, is the sense I get. It's, look at this life I've cultivated just for you. It's like, he's presenting her with some like overwhelming gift that is the wrong time for her to have. It is like just physical or material, like, sort of manifestation of like something of like maybe like a missed opportunity that cannot really be restored.
Yeah, I think it's the moment where Daisy realizes. Like, because we could say that, like, oh, it's just a dumb line, but I think it's actually kind of a brilliant way to show that there's something going on besides the house tour. And Nick Carraway's hinting at it as he's showing you this stuff, right? Like, there's clearly more to this in their kind of reunion than
yeah, we don't see so much of it, right? We just know that, like, we have this really awkward scene with the tea, right? And they're like staring at each other, and like at some point, Nick leaves the house. He sort of is like, yeah, this isn't for me, like, I'm just gonna wait outside. And like when we see them, it's like weird, and there's like something knowing between them, and Daisy's crying, and it's all very sort of, we never actually see, which is why I don't think it's actually a love story, right? Like, I mean, for 100 other reasons, but like you never actually see any like passion happen between them. You see maybe like, oh, you know, meaningful looks, or like she turns into his arm, or like, you know, someone gets a kiss on the forehead, whatever. It's like these little tiny gestures, but we don't see like the meat of what happens between them in those moments.
There's hints in the later narration from Carraway that Daisy's been going over his house quite frequently, because we only see from Carraway's perspective, so there are weeks missing at a time, kind of thing, as we go through the events. But that's
So
the
it's
whole
clear
thing,
that
is where
like
I'm
now they're having like some kind of
an
affair.
affair, yeah, and you can't say fucking because it's 1925, right?
Right.
But like he's implying it in kind of a, you know, they did this in the 50s during that like stuff with the Hays Code in movies and stuff, where like they wouldn't show sex scenes. What they would do is they'd show two people kissing, and then they'd like show a door closing or something,
Right.
implying that they were going into the bedroom, implying that they're having sex without showing a steamy, hot, you know, sex scenes or whatever.
Yeah.
That didn't happen until, you know, later, 60s.
But yeah, I guess my point with all of that is that like it's not really because, oh, she loves him. Like I don't feel like that's what the shirt scene is actually about. She's just like, this is some other life that I could have had, and I'm not fully content with my current situation, right? Like
Right.
she's jaded, she's bored, she's like, she wants, it seems like she's like in the perfect position, much like Tom, to like want the exciting new thing. And Tom maybe has the independence to sort of finance that while she doesn't. You know, she has to sneak away, and so does he, but like he's also buying his mistress like a little
Dog.
but well, yeah, doesn't he like own her apartment? Like
The
Or,
apartment
like-
that they go
or-
to have the affair in the city,
Yeah.
yeah, he owns that, and like she likes to pretend that she's a rich person's wife when they're there, and Carraway describes this in one of the earlier chapters when Tom insists he meets his woman in the city, again because this is 1925 and men just openly had affairs, I guess, married men, without consequence. So it was like, you know, he wanted to brag to Nick essentially, and then Nick said one of the first things he notices is that how, you know, the mistress Myrtle starts changing her tone when she's in the apartment and is changed into a nice dress that Tom paid for, right? She's like pretending that she's now part of the aristocracy.
yeah, and she
and really enjoying
like
that,
refers to
and
her
Tom is
dress as
using
like,
that
oh, it's
to-
just something I throw on when I don't care what I look
Right.
like. Like, so
Pretending
she's
this-
really
yeah.
awful too. Like it's
Right.
obnoxious, you know. We don't
Obno-
get the sense that she's making a
obnoxiously so.
joke. She's
Right.
like just kind of being annoying.
And you know, she doesn't understand, or maybe she does, and she's just okay with it because she's getting what she wants out of it, type thing. You know, you could put it that way, where Tom gets to have his cake and eat it too, and this woman gets to pretend to play rich lady's husband.
Well,
rich
it seems
lady-
like maybe like
know.
she wants them to, you know, she wants to leave her husband, but Tom won't leave Daisy, and gets
They-
really angry when they
imply
talk
she's
about
nice and
it,
thick,
and then
too.
he basically punches her in the face and breaks her nose.
Yeah, they imply she's nice and thick too, and busty,
Yeah.
and all the
Wide
stuff
hip.
that men crave. Yeah. But this thing, like the shirts, and that's why I keep saying this. Like she's crying, she's sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before. Like this kind of, I think it implies she doesn't know what else to say, and she's looking for a reason to explain why she just broke down in tears in front of everybody, and
Yeah.
we all kind of know anyway. Whereas,
But it's
like,
hard
she's
to.
thinking about this love that was between them, and that. Like,
But
yeah,
it's like this
that's-
past thing, and it's not. And I don't feel like it's actually about the love. It's like, oh, like this could have been my life with this man and these shirts, and like this house. Or it just could have been a different life from the one that I am currently fed up with. Right. So maybe, yeah, I don't know. I'm torn on that one. But yeah, do we want to talk about, I guess, sort of the big events?
Well, yeah, and as we get into chapter 6 here, we start getting the big events. But the one thing I wanted to point out in chapter 6 is this kind of idea of repeating the past and what we think of it. There's this conversation between Gatsby and Carraway after all that went down in the house tour and the tea and all that. And he just said, Gatsby speaking, he said, and she doesn't understand, he said. She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours, He broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. Yeah. What do we think?
Yeah, I'm looking for what page it's on here because I know I marked it.
It's like literally right before chapter 7 here, last couple paragraphs.
Yeah, I found it.
Yeah.
It's 238 to 39 in the... well, I can't really say that because you can sort of... I have the Apple Books version on my phone, and you can also change the way the text...
Right.
But yeah, it's on like 238. Yeah, I mean, there is this sort of... That's the constant thing, right? He is longing for a past that he'll never get back. And I mean, again, just out of reach of his hand. Just like, you know, he's reaching across the sound. And there are a lot of, I think, sort of moments that point back to that initial moment. But yeah, he says, I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see.
Yeah, he talked, and then Carraway's narration, he talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was.
Yeah, it's like they're both pining for older versions of themselves, but not actually quite each other.
And, you know, what are we, just repeating the past? Maybe it's like kind of a life lesson.
Sure. I mean, I think that's the whole idea of Gatsby, right? He's living his life chasing the past, right?
Or at least chasing
and
this
then
girl.
He dies. Yeah, but he's also like chasing like his former self, who he was like with this girl and who she was with him, and like his idea of them together, and like his sort of almost obnoxiously like romantic take on everything. But I guess it's not really his take on everything. We're getting it through Nick Carraway, so maybe that is actually Nick.
And put like this idea too, where it's like he's also trying to get away from his former self. Like he clearly wants to be, you know, when his father comes in at the end there, and he's like, "Oh, my son, you know, he was a big time guy." Like kind of, he wanted to get away from his kind of Midwestern small life. He wanted this grand life of luxury in New York type thing, while bringing. And I mean, he did that partly because he hated himself, I think, because Daisy couldn't get with him. He wasn't even a marriage prospect for somebody like her, because again, he was too low in class, too poor. So like, yeah, I think that it's complicated in this sense of he wants to repeat the past, but he only wants to repeat that part of him with his new self. Right. He doesn't want to be the one that she left, that she chose Tom over, and this kind of thing. And I think, you know, this is where I say that it's very masculine as well, where this is this thing that I've seen, you know, and there's tropes about, you know, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and stuff like that, right? That TV show and all that, and the kind of tropes about it and all that, right? There's levels of this everywhere, but there's this male thing where like I have a friend, dude, and you know, I'm not saying names or anything, but like he's been in love with this girl for years, and they dated for a while, and you know, they moved on. She moved on. She's married to somebody else now. My friend doesn't believe it, will not accept it, kind of thing, and he's going, you know, goes at ridiculous things to get this girl just to speak to him again. You know, he's just like, and you know, that this is just such a common thing that men do daily, kind of thing. That it's like, I just couldn't help but see the romantic side of it.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I
this
think
idea
women
of
do
like
that too to some degree.
right, it tends to be more extreme because like the men tend to get a little bit more psychotic about it, maybe, type thing.
Or maybe more inclined to like hide it or like be
Hide
sneaky
it.
about it, or I don't know. I mean, I don't actually
Yeah.
know. But yeah, I mean, like, should we talk about how? Oh, well, I guess like before we get to how everything breaks down.
Well,
No,
right
let's
in
just
the-
go to how everything breaks down.
Yeah, chapter 7's where it starts because that's when Gatsby and Tom start getting. They've known each other a few times now. They've met each other a few times, and kind of a few pages into chapter 7 here, I started seeing where, Tom sees what's happening between Daisy and Gatsby for himself because it happens right in front of him. And on this, if anybody watched White Lotus season 2, it reminded me very much of that scene at the end of season 2 where Aubrey Plaza, that one guy, is talking, ridiculously, like out of his ass, and she's just like sitting there reading a book, and she's like, "You're an idiot." And then like her husband, that was her husband's sign to know that she had cheated on him with him, because he's like, you wouldn't say that to anybody besides somebody that you had been intimate with, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like kind of, and like this is kind of the same thing. So there's this scene where he's talking, it's hot as shit in the Buchanan house. It's a hot day in the summertime. Those that are from the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic,
And
how
oppressive
humid it
heat.
gets. Yeah, how humid it gets. And it's, this isn't like the South where people are used to humidity, like William Faulkner, where everybody's sweaty all the time. This is like a rare occurrence. It's never usually this hot and humid in these parts of the country, so people don't deal with it as well as like, people living in the South where it's hot as shit all the time. But there was that little thing where Daisy's, I just marked it because I thought it was funny, where she's talking to her child and she like gets up and a tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. They're all like caked in powder.
Oh, yeah.
Jordan has powder all over her hands because listeners that don't know this, before deodorant and things like that, talcum powder was used to, because it absorbs moisture, was used to keep yourself dry and from smelling and having body odor and stuff. So like when you're really sweaty, I guess they're putting it all over their tits and stuff, like all over their bodies, to keep the sweat rings and the tit sweat and all that from like being unbearable.
Yeah.
So they're like dousing themselves in powder. But they, they're at the Buchanan's house, and there's this scene where who wants to go to town? Demanded Daisy insistently. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. Ah, she cried. You look so cool. Their eyes met, and they stared together at each other, alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. You always look so cool, she repeated. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy, as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. You resemble the advertisement of the man, she went on innocently. You know, the advertisement of the man. All right, broke in Tom quickly. I'm perfectly willing to go to town. Come on, we're all going to town. Like this kind of like, Tom saw it.
I'm breaking
he saw
it up.
They didn't say that they loved each other, but he saw it. That little interaction between one another. And this might be hard to understand for people that haven't been in long-term relationships. Like there is something, like when you know something's up because it's different, there's like a communication that's silent between, like you have to be with someone a long time to be able to pick up on these things. But like once you do, like again, that's why I brought up that season 2 of White Lotus, where like there's a big dramatic scene where it's not said, but then the husband understands what just occurred in front of him, kind of thing, because he knows his wife, right? Because they know each other. They've slept in the same bed for a decade or more, right? Like every night, like you know each other, you know the habits, the mannerisms, the inflections of voice, the attitudes, like kind of thing. And then Tom Buchanan saw it. He just saw it. Right? Oh, you're always so cool. Mm-hmm. Like him giving this kind of innocent comment under normal circumstances, right? If you're just like sitting at a party with a few friends or whatever, but then when you're sitting in this situation where they clearly have something between one another, it's obvious, right? Everybody knows. I remember being at an MFA party one time, and this guy was really into a girl that was in the the program. And I remember my wife, we weren't married at the time yet, but we were living together, engaged, and she turned to me after the party. We're driving home, and she's just like, so he follows her around like a little puppy, huh? And I was like, oh, you saw that, didn't you? Like this guy was literally following this girl around the party like a little dog. Oh, you need anything? Oh, you need, like men do this. Like they literally will die to get this woman if they want, like if they like could convince themselves that they love him, kind of thing. And like Sophie said, that could be real, that could be imagined, it could be, even if it's not though, right? Like all that matters is what happens there. But yeah, what do we think of this kind of moment of she had told him that she loved him, and Tom
Well,
became
yes,
Saul.
the beginning of the breakdown, right? They're all here in the house together, and he's trying for a recovery, right? Because he also can't just like burst out, right? Like he's been doing this for years. Like he's been having affairs with women.
It's implied as he's talking to Nick, and Nick's giving you the stuff because he lets Daisy go with Gatsby in the car, right? Everybody knows this scene from the movies and stuff. And then he's driving with Nick and Jordan, and he's saying, I think something's been going on with this Gatsby guy. He tells us that he had started a little investigation into him because he was spending a little bit too much time with his wife, kind of thing, and he was a little suspicious of this guy. And he started to find out, the secrets that this Gatsby's a liar, and he's just kind of flabbergasted that he didn't think his wife had the gall or like the balls to have an affair, kind of thing. And he says this as they argue, and it's one of the more famous lines where he's, I'm going to start taking better care of you now, kind of thing, where he started basically like admitting that, yes, everybody knows he's been having these affairs, having his cake and eating it too type thing, but he's
he can't
trying to get her.
Just like be mad at her because even though he is, right? Like, he is
he's
mad.
a piece of shit. But
he also knows that like he could have a role to play in this.
And I think this is one thing that Fitzgerald does brilliantly, is that shirt scene where she's crying. We know it's not really about the shirts, but all she can manage to say is, I've never seen such beautiful shirts before, like kind of crying, unable to even make sense of the situation. It's a stupid thing to say, right? It's dumb. And same thing with this. You always look so cool, she repeated, looking down at the table, right? Like she can't even meet eyes with him when she says it because she knows.
But, there's this moment before that, before they even get in the car, before they go to town, he's like gonna go get some whiskey. Tom is gonna go get some whiskey, and he goes inside. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. I can't say anything in his house. Old sport. Again, old sport. Very annoying through the whole thing, which is one of the things that makes him kind of like a little unlikable.
I think that's a good trope too.
Yeah,
the old sport.
Well, and how it's like kind of almost unnatural.
Yeah. If you want your like characters to sound different in dialogue, as a little trick is you give them a little quirky thing that they say or do or pronounce something, and it automatically gives your character a little bit of a quirk, differentiate them from other characters. So something like old sport, although you can't use that now because everybody's going to think Gatsby if you do that. But yeah.
Well, there's this moment right after that where Nick says, "She's got an indiscreet voice," I remarked. "It's full of..." I hesitated. "Her voice is full of money," he said suddenly. That was it. I had never understood before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the cymbal song of it. Right? And this is like a description that we get throughout the novel about her voice, right? There's something in her voice that draws people in. Like, and, he describes it sort of as music a lot of the time. And then we get this moment like, oh, it's money. Her voice has money in it. What do we make of that? Because I kind of, I mean, the only way I would think to read it is like, her voice is the voice of somebody who is well taken care of, who is used to money, who is like, has all the comforts of life.
There's an arrogance and an irresponsibility, I think, to people, especially people that are born into money. So if you didn't have to work for it, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? We get mad at people like that, but some people are just lucky they're born into.
But people are also very charmed by it.
They're charmed by it because you have things that they want, but it's like, there is this level of, and I think that it kind of shows this stuff about Gatsby too. Like Gatsby's not dumb, like he's not stupid. I think the lies got so big that he couldn't keep up with it at a certain point, but also like, it's clear he knows that in order to even have a chance with this girl, he needs to give her money. Like he needs to have money for her, kind of thing.
But like it's also another moment that I think kind of reveals her as a character who's like kind of gross.
Right. Well, like, and I think it's him kind of admitting that, where he's kind of like, she never used to be like that, or maybe she was always like that.
I think it's suggested that she was always kind of like that, right? Like that he was not of the right breed of man for her. Like, he was of the wrong stock or something. And that's like kind of what drew him in. Like that she was like this unattainable thing that he would reach for, just like to see if he could. And then it became an obsession. And he's like, and we fell in love.
And she loved him. Like,
at least then, or like,
Yeah.
I mean, but yeah, there's that whole thing about how like Gatsby just wants her to say that she never loved Tom and just like undo the last however 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, you want to go to that scene where they're like actually in the apartment and he's saying it like, you never loved him, kind of after the big blow up, when it's all out in the open now. Page 647 in mine, in chapter 7, I believe. Okay, so here's the main scene. I'll read it to you. It's only a few paragraphs. So they're, everybody knows the scene. They're in that apartment, or they're in that hotel room, because they rent that hotel room to drink mint juleps in, because again, it's so awkward. Everybody's kind of reeling. They don't know what to do. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years? Not seeing, said Gatsby. No, we couldn't meet, but both of us loved each other all that time, old sport. And you didn't know. I used to laugh sometimes, but there was no laughter in his eyes. To think that you didn't know. Oh, that's all. Tom tapped his thick fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. You're crazy, he exploded. I can't speak about what happened 5 years ago because I didn't know Daisy then, and I'll be damned if I see how you got within a mile of her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's a goddamn lie. Daisy loved me when she married me, and she loves me now. No, said Gatsby, shaking his head. She does, though. The trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas in her head and doesn't know what she's doing. He nodded sagely. And what's more, I love Daisy, too. Once in a while I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself, but I always come back, and in my heart I love her all the time. You're revolting, said Daisy. She turned to me, and her voice, dropping an octave lower, filled the room with thrilling scorn. Do you know why we left Chicago? I'm surprised that they didn't treat you to the story of that little spree. Gatsby walked over and stood beside her. Daisy, that's all over now, he said earnestly. It doesn't matter anymore. Just tell him the truth, that you never loved him, and it's all wiped out forever. She looked at him blindly. Why, how could I love him, possibly? You never loved him. She hesitated. Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realized at last what she was doing, and as though she had never, all along, intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. I never loved him, she said, with perceptible reluctance. Yeah, great fucking scene, dude. Great fucking scene. Again, big famous scene. Everybody knows this scene because it's like the big blow up where Gatsby smashes the glass. And again, I think Leo did it pretty well. There, everybody talks Robert Redford. I think Leo did a pretty good job in that, playing Gatsby in that pink suit. And this is where basically this is the climax, right?
Yep.
Although we get the murder eventually after this too, but like this is basically the dramatic climax.
Yeah, I mean, it's so deeply awkward. It's like they're all here. It's only happening between 3 people, but there are more people present, right? Like,
right.
Nick is here, and Jordan, with whom he is like, somewhat entangled, is here, and basically we realize, like, yeah, I mean, there was something about Daisy being like, this idea that Daisy was never going to actually do anything, that she was just sort of rolling along, much like Tom. Like she is a lot like Tom. Like she was never going to do anything. She was going to have this affair, and it was going to be like her thing, her fun thing. But she never had any intention of actually leaving her husband, much in the way he never had any intention of leaving her.
Right.
And it's just like, there is something really selfish in Gatsby here, right? Tell him you never loved him. Like, he's so insistent on that.
Right.
And we don't know if she had ever maybe told him that to sort of make him happy or whatever. And even later when he tells Nick, I think, like, oh, you don't understand. She didn't know what she was saying.
Well, that, and then, like, you know, after she says this out loud, Tom, the very next line in that, Tom starts bringing up memories of them together, right? Not that day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry. There was a husky tenderness in his tone. Daisy? Please don't. Her voice was cold, but the rancor was gone from it. She looked at Gatsby. There, Jay, she said, but her hand as she tried to light a cigarette was trembling. Suddenly she threw the cigarette and the burning match on the carpet. Oh, you want too much, she cried to Gatsby. I love you now. Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past. She began to sob helplessly. I did love him once, but I loved you too. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. You loved me too? He repeated. Even that's a lie, Tom said savagely. She didn't know you were alive. Why, there are things between Daisy and me that you'll never know, things that neither of us can ever forget. The words seemed to bite physically into Gatsby. I want to speak to Daisy alone, he insisted. She's all excited now. Even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom, she admitted in a pitiful voice. It wouldn't be true. Of course it wouldn't, Tom agreed. She turned to her husband. As if it mattered to you, she said. Of course it matters. I'm going to take better care of you from now on. You don't understand, said Gatsby with a touch of panic. You're not going to take care of her any more. I'm not? Tom opened his eyes wide and laughed. He could afford to control himself now. Why's that? Daisy's leaving you. You know.
And clearly she isn't. She's like, you know, I can't stand this. And she runs outside.
Like, and then Tom's like, nonsense. And she's like, I am, though, she said with a visible effort. She's not leaving me. Tom's words suddenly leaned down over Gatsby. Certainly not for a common swindler who'd have to steal the ring he put on her finger. Yeah, and then she starts, you know, I won't stand this, cried Daisy. Oh, please, let's get out.
Yeah.
And this one, yeah, and Tom's basically like, yeah, this is it. But that's the big pivotal climax in it. She tells her husband, and then she, you know, they do, I guess she'd been telling Gatsby that's what was going to happen. And then it comes time for it to happen, and she realizes that actually she didn't mean it all that much, but also she did.
Yeah, I think maybe she, like, I just get the sense that she never had the intention of actually following through.
Well, and she's portrayed as very aloof, very non-committal, very kind of, I don't know, life just happens to me. You know, I'm a beautiful woman and all these men want me and I just let it happen, you know, life just happens to me kind of thing. And it's just that moment where it all comes to fruition here.
And then there's... oh, go on.
Well, I mean, it's as good as, like, you know, Mamet said, this is as good as it gets in terms of drama, dialogue, and stuff back and forth. The gossip is all coming out, like the affairs, all of that. Like, this is as good as it gets. And I mean, I think it's well done. This is why we remember this scene. This is why we make it into movies still, kind of thing. Yeah. And most of Fitzgerald's stuff has this kind of tragic lost love ending. Very tragic figure.
Yeah, so then we get sort of, well, one of the last few final events, right? So it's just like the last 3 chapters are just like, you know, a chaos, complete chaos. Everything's kind of breaking down. And we get the wife, or, you know, Tom's mistress.
Yeah, Myrtle.
And Myrtle and her husband, and they're like fighting. There was like also like this moment where Tom realizes that he's trying to, that Mr. Wilson is trying to like take his wife and just like get out. Like, we're gonna move. We're gonna.
He found out that she was having an affair. Yeah. In movie versions, they talk about the pearls and stuff that she had, but in the book, it's a dog collar.
Yeah, it's a dog collar because she really wanted a little dog, and they get a dog,
and it's like more expensive dog collar than she could have afforded. Type thing, you know.
Well, and like also why, but but they're fighting at some point. Like, we see them fighting, and a moment later, she rushed out into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting. Before she could move from his door, the business was over. And then we, you know, go into the story of what actually happened. So she was hit by a car.
killed instantly. Her breast was hanging off. That's what they describe. That's like the
Yeah.
most description. And then we get a little bit of description of like, yeah, she's basically ripped open because she got hit by a car going too fast. But yeah, what about that? Like when we get like Wilson going after Gatsby,
Yeah.
and you know, Wilson's the one that shoots Gatsby at the end. But a lot of people know that ending again because this is a very popular story. But like, you know, what I was focused on is this kind of Nick's final kind of chapters after that, when we find out, and Nick is kind of the only one to mourn his friend's loss. And we talked about this a little already, where he's really kind of angry and shocked that he's the only one that called himself a friend of Gatsby that is showing up.
Well, and
to all
also
these
this was
things.
like a revenge killing, but you know, Gatsby wasn't. He was also just the owner of the car. He was not the one driving, right? Daisy was driving the car.
Daisy, he died for her. That's what I'm
Yeah.
gonna stake my hill to die on. He loved her so much he died for her, kind of thing. Which was kind of inevitable, was always going to happen, but like, yeah.
I think he was like too sort of hopeful that he like that just was a consequence that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. Well, what's that?
But then
the
we
first line we
discover,
quoted?
right? We discover that Tom
Reserving
was,
judgments is a matter of infinite hope.
well, and also, you know, we learned that Tom was the one who sort of
Sicked
Yeah.
Wilson after him to
Yeah.
protect himself. And Daisy, to some extent,
Yeah.
because Daisy's the one that killed him. But yeah. So he literally dies to protect her
yeah,
in
so
a way.
and you know, I guess Wilson also like killed himself, maybe.
He killed himself after he killed
Yeah.
Gatsby, yeah. They write that
So they're
they
both
found his
dead.
body in the bushes.
And it's like, you know, sort of this grisly scene, and
But what do we think of Nick and like his mourning?
that's where,
aftermath.
yeah, I mean, well, one of his last interactions with Gatsby, right? He gives him this one and only compliment that he has ever given, and says like, "You're worth more than all of them. Like all of these motherfuckers, fuck them. Your value is greater."
Right.
And it's a weird moment because he's like, you know, I didn't really like him, but I don't regret giving him this compliment. And then, of course, because the next thing that happens is Gatsby dies. What I was less sure of is why that compliment does happen
Right.
when it does.
Well, I think because this goes back to me kind of like, as I was reading this, I found myself rooting for Gatsby, even, you know, knowing how it ends kind of thing. And I think Nick is supposed to feel that to some extent too. Is that, yeah, there's things that he learned about him, but even at the same time, like even when he's learning about his lies, Nick has this tendency to defend him.
Yeah.
And maybe it has to do with the charm. Maybe he was charmed by him. Maybe, but I think it's more so like he affected his life. Like Nick learned something from being a part of this, from being involved in it at all, just for the dumb fact that he rented this house, you know, and got involved in this drama with his cousin. And he said at the end, like, he's not even really talking to his cousin anymore. He didn't really talk to her before Gatsby either, but then this kind of,
Well, I think
you know,
he recognizes that they're kind of gross, but also like understands that the people around Gatsby were kind of gross, that they were sort
Right.
of,
and I think how alone
yeah.
they were, despite the parties, even Gatsby himself, how alone he was. And you see Nick mostly being alone this whole time, although there's mentions of him hanging out with Jordan, though we don't see it that often. Like, he's living alone, like all these people with this kind of lonely, wealthy lives. And maybe that's why we see this last chapter.
Well, it's all
of
really
Nick.
kind of sad too, right? Like even with Gatsby, it's just like he keeps talking about this pool, right? Oh, but you know, I haven't gone for a swim all summer. I haven't been in the pool all summer. They're talking about draining the pool. Don't do it yet. I haven't. Like I could still go for a swim. You know, like even these small things. Like he's not even enjoying like this life that he created.
Right.
But still like believing that he could, you know. But yeah, so Gatsby's dead. He meets Gatsby's father, and you know, that was sort of sweet. And Gatsby's father clearly thought very highly of his son and, you know, thought that he'd be a great man. And then it's just like, yeah, he's just ringing for anybody. He's like calling everybody. He's trying to find Gatsby's friends, his family, just anybody.
Well, and I think the father is there to show the juxtaposition between how Nick is feeling about it versus how his father felt, where his father believed the lies still, right? So his father's very proud, carries around this wrinkled picture of Gatsby's mansion in his wallet or whatever, and wants to show everybody that this is his son's house. Look how fine it is. And this is when he's in the house and his son is dead already too, but like he just keeps kind of going about this, and Nick is kind of sitting there being like, well, you know, all that's a lie, right? Like, kind of thing, but doesn't want to tell him. And this kind of, like I said, I was really intrigued by this last chapter of just Nick mourning the death of his friend, because Gatsby, despite all of this, I think he did consider him a friend, right? Like, they talked to one another and shared their experiences and things like that, and Gatsby would invite him things and offer him things, and yeah. So it is supposed to, I guess it's supposed to be conflicting, but I think that's why we see the father at the end there, to juxtapose, like, to be the opposite of Nick in this situation. Meyer Wolfsheim.
Yeah.
Fixing the 1919 World Series, or 1918
Oh,
World
yeah. Well,
Series.
even that, like, what was the line? I think I even wrote that one down. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the fixed World Series. But if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened. The end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 50 million people with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. Yeah, what'd you make of that? And that's in an earlier chapter. That's in chapter 4.
I think that shows, I think, one, it's a great scene. It's a great little detail to include in like a novel like this. But also I think it's there to show how naive Nick is, that he's not quite a part of this world.
I was wondering if it's like a parallel to Gatsby. If it's like a man playing with the faith of this many people and
Sure.
sort of this life that he's created.
Yeah, I mean, I could buy that. I think that's plausible. I think, yeah, and I think, it's meant to show corruption, but also this kind of Nick is shown to have never even considered this possibility before. That's how kind of out of the loop he is, or how kind of naive or, painfully honest he likes to think of himself as.
Well, he's not hanging out with these men, right? Like, he's not hanging out with the men who are, like, doing these kinds of deals. Yeah, I mean, I think that when I read this one passage where Nick is talking about Tom and Daisy, I'm like, okay. Like, I felt validated in my reading of them. I felt like, all right, this was wise. Like, this was well done. Where he says, and for me it's 389. It's like maybe 10 pages from the end. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together. And and let other people clean up the mess they had made. Right. I mean, that is like how they feel throughout the story. Although, again, Tom still feels like a more real character than Daisy to me. She still feels like this weird manic pixie, like, depiction
I
of a
mean, when
woman.
you think of like an upper class woman at that time,
Yeah.
probably was,
But
because
she
she wasn't
still
allowed to do
feels
much
like
else.
hollow,
Yeah.
but I also feel like we don't get as much of her as we get of Tom in a real way. Right? Like, we see Tom with his mistress. We don't really see Daisy with Gatsby. I don't ever get a sense that we get a true Daisy anywhere in this novel, right? She is so suppressed to me that she feels kind of hollow. I don't know if that was intended, I don't think she's supposed to be likable.
The Golden Girl.
Yeah.
What they said.
Yeah, that's like the end, you know? He goes to the funeral. It's just like 3 of them. 3 of them there. Right, and sort of maybe like a callback to that initial scene of Gatsby. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther. And one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And it's like almost like, yeah, but it's also like, it feels very much like an explanation of that earlier scene. Yeah. Any thoughts? Any last remarks?
Said it's great. Read it.
Yeah, it's definitely worth. I mean, like, I've sort of railed against reading this. I think because I tried so many times and it just like sort of decided I didn't really like him. I don't know. I enjoyed the last few chapters when shit started to hit the fan. Again, yeah, fucking read it. I was bored at the beginning. Knew the story. You probably know the story too. You've probably seen a movie.
Yeah, I think everybody should. I think that, yeah, like you need to read it because there is this kind of, I remember when I was in school and I would use this excuse too, where I would be, oh, fuck Fitzgerald. And I had never read, you know, any of the stuff. It's just something people pick up. They hear people say and they think it sounds cool because it's like dissing what people hold up as great books. And then, so I would definitely, yeah, buy it. Or, I mean, this one is so out there, so popular. You can find free copies. You can find dollar used copies. You can find anything and just give it a read and decide for yourself. Just don't repeat what somebody told you to say about this book or all that bullshit. But of course we can say it. People are going to keep doing it. But yeah, that's it. That's Gatsby.
That's Gatsby.
All right. Reminder to listeners, we're still looking for workshop horror stories. If you have a workshop horror story you want to share with us, please send that to heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. We also have a subscription plan. You can subscribe to this podcast at patreon.com/heavyboard, receive full, uncensored episodes for subscribers only. If you don't want to do that, can't afford it, there are other ways to support us. You can leave us a 5-star review on Apple. That helps us out, helps us grow. Please do that. If you don't want to do that, you can check it out on our YouTube channels where we put all the free episodes up there as well as clips. If you don't have time to listen to the full episode, give us a subscribe, a like, a share on YouTube. That helps us out. And of course, links to all the books and shit that we covered in the description. And this next couple episodes, y'all, this is something we've been wanting to do. You're in for a treat. At least book lovers are, literature lovers, is we're going to do a deep dive into complete works of Emily Dickinson. And that's going to be a lot of fun. So get out your Dickinson collections. And Sophie and I are going to break that up.
Get out that dick.
Yeah. Pull out your dick and...
Pull out your dick.
Yeah. Pull out your Dickinson and... start flapping it open. No, like there's like but yeah, so Sophie and I planned to hit this. We didn't want to hit, like, some of you that have this or know what we're talking about, the complete Dickinson. It's like 1,000-page book, isn't it? Like it's
stupid long.
It's a massive tome of all her poems, and we wanted to break that up, so we didn't want to squeeze that all into like a 2-hour episode. We're going to break that up into a couple parts. Stay tuned. And this has been Heavy Board. See ya.
Suck my dick.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
shows such a lack of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.